briefly recap what I was saying, which is that we, after looking at perception and attention to some extent, uh, we move to memory for today's class and the next class on Monday. And the interesting part about memory is it's over-encompassing. I mean, essentially, from being able to perceive yourself in front of the mirror, or know what's your name is, or remember what's your name is, to same thing with your friends and parents and family, colleagues. Um, we would not be able to do even simple things in life, including figuring out what is a pen, for example, or where is my mobile. That's locational memory. Where is the pen is object recognition, as you know, from form perception, but also to remember that is your pen, not somebody else's. Then we also remember certain episodes, which are sometimes called episodic memory, about how yesterday went, for example, or if you have a pet, what's the name of your pet, what's the interaction with your pet. Likewise, there are certain kinds of things that we remember as facts, which are also called declarative memory, because they declare or they are propositions. For example, New Delhi is the capital of India. Now, our job is to figure out how exactly we do it, what are the kinds of memory that we have, and how does memory operate. The more difficult question to ask is what is memory? And that's where I was starting, just for you to get a sense of what memory is, right? So what do you think about memory? And perhaps also ask some difficult but interesting questions about memory, whether memory gets formed during when we sleep, or whether it is whether you can enhance it to a certain extent, as many of the books and even now drugs claim to be able to do. Now there are pharmaceutical drugs to increase memory. So what are your opening comments? What do you know about it? What have you read? What do you think about it, so that we can take on from there? Anybody can start. If there are a couple of people, then I request Pallavi to schedule them one after another. Okay, so let's start with a simple question. What is memory according to you?
So any information that is stored in our brain.
Yes, so like it is an ability to store the information and data in our mind.
It is a
Okay,
collection of knowledge, facts, perceptions.
And sir, also for how much time it will remain in our mind, how much extent up to it will remain up to how many
mm-hmm.
days. It's also depend.
It is
Yeah.
any act or events which is stored in our mind.
Okay, wonderful. So you already talk about acts, actions, I believe, events which are episodic, stuff that is declarative, and also informative elements. So the whole point of the cognitive revolution was to think of us being able to process information. As I've been highlighting, that's the more modern mainstream way of thinking about psychology also, which is that we are able to process different kinds of information, store them, work with them, understand them, and then operate on them to um, you know to form newer ideas and newer knowledge within our heads themselves. And very interestingly, some use the word mind, some use the word brain. We really did not yet talk about these kinds of dualisms between whether it's mind or brain. Typically, people use mind as a more generic catch-all term and think that it is um, it is operationalized or it is implemented via the brain. That's the modern thinking, and that's what we'll probably stick to. Okay, so I think there are pretty interesting first-hand comments. So let me start with one example of a study that became very famous. Uh, so this was done by Cho and colleagues in 2001. And this is a field study. And as I was saying, I will give examples both from lab studies and field studies and actual life so that we have a mix and match and we understand the concept better. I think that's very important. So this was done with 20 flight attendants. And the major question that Joe was asking is, well, what happens to memory when you are moving across different time zones? And that's very interesting because once you change time zones, you essentially change your circadian rhythms, you change when you are going to sleep. And we now know through modern research that a lot of memory consolidation happens during sleep. So it's very important to sleep well, by the way, for those who don't, because that is where, that is when, rather, most of the consolidation in our brains happen. And it's very important for people to have good sleep. Now, the problem with flight attendants, especially at that time, was that they did not get a lot of good sleep, and also if they did, they had to sleep at very different times, especially when you are traveling across time zones. And this is true even for anybody who travels, including salespeople and um, sometimes top-notch professionals. If you have to travel a lot across different countries, this is the same problem. Uh, and people do fall asleep, which in colloquial language is called jet lag, simply because you want to sleep at a certain time that you're used to, but now because you have moved to a different country, that flips or that changes by certain hours. So what Cho and colleagues wanted to study is that what really happens to memory when people were moving from, let's say, India to Europe to US. um, do they I mean, does that matter? In what sense does it matter? And how does that affect their work, or how does it affect the industry, the airline industry in general, when it comes to both safety and service? So it has lots of large social and international implications, but the study essentially is about consolidation of memory. And it is also to figure out how memory is embedded in the life we lead. So it's not like, you sit at a table, you memorize stuff and you move out, which is what a lot of lab studies do. But this is about how you live. And that's why this study became a very, very important study. And I will also tell you what eventually happened. This became a landmark study, by the way, and heavily cited and used in multiple policy making. So before I get to the details and the results and the implications of the study, what is your hunch? If you, for example, would have done the study yourself, what do you expect to find? Yeah, anybody can uh, go ahead, please. You think about your own self. Days when you stayed awake the whole night, wrote the exam in the morning or in the afternoon slot, and then what happens? And what if you know, I know it's a um, very bad thing to say, but what if you would have exams every alternate weeks, for example, instead of 2 weeks in the full semester? And imagine for the time being that um, your sleeping schedules would get disrupted. What would happen to life in general for us? Think of that angle, and then you can extrapolate that to what flight attendants typically go through, especially when they have to work for long hours, 9 to 12 hours, overhaul flights. And that's to you're getting up in one country and unboarding in another country, going to sleep in that country, again getting up from that country and unboarding in another country, getting to sleep in that country, which means that all the time zones are messed up.
So
we
like
would be sleep deprived, and that would in turn make us irritable and lazy, sort of.
Okay, yeah, it will make you irritable. What will it do to memory now that we are talking about memory specifically in today's class?
Sir,
Yes.
memory is based that how we perceive things, how we have, how much attention we have paid. If we are sleep deprived, then the the level of our attention will automatically be decreased, and we won't be able to capture information uh, as much as we should have been. So it would automatically affect.
Yeah. This is the crux of it, right? So the information that gets processed, which is the perceptual stage, depending on what you attend to, is not happening independently. We have feedback networks in the brain that enable us to realize or figure out where should we attend to, and a lot of where should we attend to is essentially dependent on how the memory processes are working for us to be able to select that information. So when you are sleep deprived, yes, you are irritable because you can't really process information well. You can't also learn new things because of the same issue and other things that I will uh, suggest. But also interestingly, remember that, and this is the part I want to highlight, many people think psychology to be different from biology. And that, I think, is one of the classic mistakes. In fact, that's also a philosophical mistake because it slips you into dualism. You separate the mind from the body, which is a classic wrong thing to do. But sadly, even now, students and sometimes faculty and sometimes textbooks and sometimes even boards and their syllabuses separate them out and say, oh, this is psychology, this is neuroscience, or this is biology, this is psychology, or this is mind, this is brain. Please, my one humble message is, don't do that. The way science has progressed over the last few years, we can't really separate out psychology from biology. In fact, now there's a new field called biological psychology, or there's a new field called cognitive neuroscience, or we also have sometimes called neuropsychology, simply because you can't separate them out. And these studies and many other studies like that clearly show that you can't. But somehow to be able to think that we are or we should separate these out is the start of a mistake, both an academic mistake, also a philosophical mistake. So that's another outcome of this. Now, for the policy, what this became a landmark study because after this studies was put forth, there was a lot of pressure created by the employees of multiple international airlines, especially those who fly across different time zones and countries, to have better work ethics and also work culture. So it had a lot of organizational behavior and human resource outcomes from this kind of a psychological study. And now it's mandated not to change time zones within a certain amount of hours for the same person. Also, they are bound, the company is now bound to force um, about 8 hours of sleep, not force, I mean enable 8 hours of sleep, both for pilots and also for uh, attendants, including air host and air hostesses. This was not the case before this study. Still about 2000, there was a lot of work pressure simply because of sleep deprivation, which did start affecting their memory. I mean, they have evidences to show that the attendants simply forgot many of the things of whom they have to charge money from, who has asked for a certain kind of a juice, when sometimes even when the flight is supposed to take off. So they were having a lot of memory issues, and these are substantial memory issues that then gets oscillated into irritation, bad behavior, questionable ethics at the workplace, and many other kinds of stuff. So there, it's really not it's not a HR issue or not an organizational behavior issue. It's an issue of how memory actually works and interacts with sleep cycles, which is a pure biological question. So this is the kind of broad base and linkages between what we study about psychology to what it really converts to businesses and services and products. That is what this course's message is, both in and outside. So now let me zoom in to the brain itself. And one important aspect that, again, gets missed out when we are talking about memory. In fact, nobody yet mentioned it, but I would want to, you know, talk a little bit about it, is the effect of hormones. But before I do that, uh, there are a couple of things that you should remember about the names of brain areas. And I think now it's a good time for us to start using the names. Till now, I have desisted to do so, but I think minimally you should know these parts. So this is how the head is, you see, and this is what the brain is. So this frontal area is called the frontal lobe simply because of the positioning that it has in the brain. It is also credited to be one of the executive control areas which have networks between many other areas in the brain, but primarily associated with control and decision making. This area towards the middle of your skull is called the parietal lobe, mainly to do with spatial and object recognition and also to figure out where things are. The temporal lobe, mostly credited to memory, specifically to facts and also to words and objects. So if you have to figure out what that is, so if I have to know, okay, this is a pen, the object pen, the image or the name pen is thought to be uh, predominantly coded in the temporal lobe. And occipital lobe towards the back is mainly to do with vision or visual attention. This area is supposed to mainly be relevant with balance and motor control. And from here onwards, the brain gets stuck. This is also called a midbrain area. And you have a medulla here. And this gets associated or stuck into a fluid like hollow space here to where the spinal cord gets and fitted in here. So this is a very, very crucial area where many people, if they sustain injuries, they might not be surviving, or even if they're surviving, it might lead to paralysis or coma, because it's a very important juncture of communication, especially motor communication between the brain and the whole of your body through the spinal cord. Now, hormones are, you might know, are biological substances, well, actually biochemical substances, and they play a lot of effects on almost everything that we do, including decision making, and including memory formation. Many a times, hormones are mainly related with emotions, but again, emotions are not separate from memory or from perception or from attention. So another big mistake that many books do is give you the sense that these are separatable processes. So you can separate perception from attention, or you can separate memory from learning, or you can separate emotion from memory. You can't, because in real life, you are actually dealing with one single thing, and that will encompass almost all of these facets or all of these aspects. So when you're talking about memory, you are emotional. So emotion does have an effect on memory, but the memories themselves are also emotional, as many of you might already know by commonsensical or experiential understanding. Similarly, when you talk of the effect of hormone, specifically here it's about cortisol, which is a stress hormone, by the way. When you are highly stressed, you have high levels of cortisol, which is not a good thing. And sleep, good sleep, reduces the level of cortisol, along with many other kinds of dietary and activity-based interventions that you can have for normal daily good living. But it's also important to realize that, again, these show how entwined the mind and the brain is. Hormone is very much a topic of study in psychology. It's also a topic of study in biochemistry. And it can also be a topic of study in biophysics. So that is where we are going towards. We need to have more of these interdisciplinary dialogues for us, because actually in life or inside our body, things are not separated out the way we do it in our textbooks. This is another important message that I wanted to share with you all as we move forward. All right, so now let us look at specific aspects of how we can categorize memory into different kinds. So very quickly, what's the capital of Brussels?
Brussels
Sir,
is
I
the
have,
capital.
Sorry, what did you
sir, I
say?
have,
The capital of Belgium.
sir, I have a doubt in the previous slide. Can I ask?
Yeah, we'll go back to that, Purvi, but just, yeah, let's hear a couple of these responses, then I'll go back to the slide. Sorry, I somehow missed what you all said about the first question. The capital of Brussels.
Brussels itself is the capital.
All right. Anybody disagrees with that? All right. Okay. Yeah, that's a catch question. What could be the memory mechanisms that might have come into force when you thought about the question, irrespective of whether you figured it out, whether it's a catch question or not? You know, if you have to lay down an algorithm for it, what would be the at least some kind of intuitive steps to do that? No idea? Okay, no problem. We'll talk about it. Capital of Greenland. Anybody can give an answer to that? What's the capital of Greenland?
Nuke.
This is not class. You can Google up.
So nuke.
Nuke.
Okay. Sorry, I missed slides. Is it a more harder question than the first one?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so what makes this hard? Now think about it. You can also take examples from exam questions that you all have experienced till now. I mean, right from whatever class 4, 5 that you can remember. What makes a question difficult or harder? Specifically, these kinds of trivia questions where you don't really have to use any analysis. Either you know it or you don't. But why are some questions harder than the other?
Like, so
It
we do not
depends.
heard about these countries. Like, we do not know about the capitals.
Yeah. So is it hard or is it unknown?
Yes, sir,
Sir,
this is
it
not hard,
can,
but it is
Unknown.
unknown. Yes.
It's an
sir,
unknown
it
type of
might even
question.
be hard
Sir, it is
because we might
sometimes
have learned.
unknown, but it is also less recalled one.
So sometimes the more detailed things we are asked are more difficult to answer.
Yeah, that's true. Okay. See, there is a thing about known. There's also something as um, not known, and there's something called unknown. Anybody knows what's the difference between them? And these are all to do with memory. So either you know, or it's unknown to you, or it's not known to you. And that is, of course, a question of being in memory. So this also helps you start thinking of how my first slightly more difficult question of what is memory through such kinds of activities, instead of just giving a definition, which anyway is boring.
So known is something which we know about. Unknown is we might have heard somewhere, but we can't recall, or we don't know about it, but everybody else does. And not known is it is not discovered yet.
Yeah, wonderful. So between the known and unknown, what probably might be the mechanisms that we are trying to implement in our memory when we search for information?
So we try to recall from our permanent memory if we have ever heard about it or something.
Yeah. So what's permanent memory then?
So the facts which are stored in our brain and remain with us
How
for a
long?
longer period of time. Longer than Maybe a year or something.
Okay, wonderful. So very good. Intuitive starting. Yeah, I mean this is one of the most difficult questions. Um, how long does information really retain in our memory? So let's try a couple of other examples, and then we'll come back to it. And also have to get back to the other previous slide. I remember. Third question: how many hours you slept on last Tuesday?
6.
Okay.
6.5.
Anybody who does not
4.
remember or cannot answer?
5.
4. Okay.
Don't remember.
Sir, can't say because daily we sleep different. Sometimes I sleep different number of hours.
Mm-hmm. So is this a difficult question? Is it known? Is it unknown? What is it?
Sir, it depends on how old the how old the incident is, because last Tuesday means we will have to and then recall what all happened on that day.
Mm-hmm.
What were the incidents happened when I was unable to or was able to sleep that much. So I had to recall the incidents that followed and followed that particular day. So it includes recalling a lot of stuff. Then I
Mm.
can actually recall what all happened exactly.
Right.
So
So
I think it
is
won't
it a
be
known thing? Sorry, go ahead.
I think it won't be difficult if something significant happened on that day. Like for me, Tuesday, I had assignments and quiz, so I remember it that I was not able to sleep that much. But for someone who didn't have any significant thing on that day, they might have forgotten.
Okay. So is it known or unknown?
Some
So
most
It is
it is
probably
known.
it is
deliberately
unknown.
unknown.
Most probably it is unknown.
So for some it is known and for some it is unknown.
Sir, I wouldn't call it known because we can't answer for 100% sure with 100% surety that we exactly slept this many hours. It is a vague kind of answer that everyone gives. For
Sir,
example, a
it is
person saying 6 hours is not exactly sleeping 6 hours, 0 minutes, 0 seconds type.
sir, it is known, but it depends whether this information is worthy to be stored in the memory. So it is somewhere, but we can't actually recall because we never paid too much. We don't give priority for storing such stuffs in our memory. So it's unknown.
Awesome. So you see, from your own already understandings that you have about memory, a lot of things are coming out. So there could be informative elements that's stored in memory that is simply harder because we don't exactly know how to access it. So there's a difference between
Serious elements for metabolic.
Sorry, I didn't get that. Did you say something? So let me yeah, so something that makes it difficult is also about at two stages. One, at the encoding stage itself. So when you are storing the information, it can be difficult to encode. Something can also become difficult when you're trying to recall it, which is the example that is from the third question. So when we say that our memory is failing, it could be that the problem is either at the encoding stage or at the recall stage, and accordingly we'll see later that there are models that tell you what happens when you encode information and what happens when you recall information, and things are different, and they're separable. As the third example says, you are also very right that depending on if there is a top-down reason for us to be paying attention to a certain kind of information, then we are going to encode it better, which is also probably increasing the chances of recalling it better. Because we did not encode the hours of sleeping that each of us did on last Tuesday. And of course, I'm saying last Tuesday, I'm not saying Tuesday 2 years before that, because that's completely, I mean, unless something drastic happened, we don't remember any of those Tuesdays anyway. But this is something which is still probably at least vaguely in our memory. That's why I said last Tuesday. So some of you were saying that, you're right in that if it's too long away, then obviously we have no information about it, or we don't seem to have any information about it. It may or may not be there in our head, but it's simply extremely hard for us to recall it. But even if it is next Tuesday, it makes it hard depending on what did happen on Tuesday. If Tuesday was, as somebody was saying, is a common day, then it's harder. But if Tuesday was a special day, then it's difficult. Okay, so what about the fourth one? How does your best friend's face look like? Can you explain that?
Yes, sir. I think it would be easier to recall like round face, long hair, certain eye color because we see them on a daily basis. Sorry, I'm
Yeah,
muted.
yeah. Any other? Sorry, yeah, I was muted. Any other?
It is harder because we see the generally many people, and by seeing them we can recognize them easily. He is this, he is this. But when we recognize their face or something like that, we have to face the difficulty. Oh, I didn't remember that. How long nose was it? How faces was long, or hair was straight, or what so on, curly. But we can recognize them easily by seeing the face.
Right. So are you saying that talking about it or explaining it is difficult, but recognition as a task is easier?
Yeah, recognizing by seeing them.
By seeing, yes. So do you all remember what we were talking about when we talked about faces in our perception classes? How does that relate to memory then now? Can anybody start drawing the link? When we talked of object perception, I showed two faces. One was easy to understand, that is the same face when the person had or did not have beard, which I think was Prince Charles. The other one, who was another person, it was difficult to understand whether it's the same face, whether or not that person has beard. Now, if your friend's face, whatever it is it easier or difficult for us to to talk about or to recall now? But it's easier for us to recognize it when you see it. Yes, that's absolutely right. Again, in memory, just immediately I'll show you that there's a difference between recall and recognition. And now we know what are the differences between recall and recognition. And this is a classic example of that recalling a friend's face is much more difficult, but recognizing a face is much more easier. But why is that the case? Any link with how perception or object recognition happens that you already know about?
Sir, we can say in the recognition, we somehow try to compare the things. There is someone which is in the front of us, and there is some image or memory of the same person in our mind. So, in recognition, we try to compare. In the next case, we have to uh, judge all the parts of all the features of the person.
Okay, yeah, wonderful. So, and what happens in recall?
In recalling, sir, we have to uh, make the features. We can say there is no something comparison or any other things. We have to present what is in our memory. We have to try to explain.
All right. Fantastic. Now, can you link that with the theories of perception that we talked about, where you were recognized, where we were talking about, how do you recognize an A is an A, for example? There were 4 such theories that we talked about. As cues, they are template matching, prototype theory, Gestalt theory, and feature analysis. What probably might be at the heart of being able to recall your friend's face, and what might be at the heart of recognizing your friend's face? And again, I'm doing this for you all to realize how intricately perception and attention and memory are intertwined. They are not separate again, just to repeat the point.
So template matching.
Template matching. You do realize for template matching, the biggest cost is the search cost, right? Because it's a one-to-one algorithm. So if your friend has changed the hair, whether it's a male or female, would template matching be able to handle that change and still say, oh, you are still you, kind of thing? But it's still, I mean, once any change you see in your friend, whichever way,
So
it's
we
still
look for
starting.
features. We look for features which are similar when we first see him, and later on we try to exactly try to map them for their locations and their proportions, and we can perceive them. Yes, he's the one that I know.
Okay, yeah. I think you're moving in the right direction. Template matching might also be somewhat possible if you allow that to have flexibility to enable errors, or to work with errors. The errors, I mean, when there are certain changes in your friend's face, um, you still recognize the face, but that does not explain recall, by the way, because in recall, there is no stimuli in front of you, so the friend is not in front of you, right? So you have to reconstruct the face from your memory of your friend, which obviously makes it a more difficult task to do, but it also tells you that the same theories might not be enough for us to explain it. All right, the last question: how do you tie your shoes? Well, if it need not be lace, but it could also be straps for females, but essentially anything where you have to move your hand to fix up your shoe. How do we know how to do it, or how do we remember to do it?
Sir, I have a question
Yeah, go ahead.
that what what we do in our daily life, we generally don't remember that. If we I am asking that if we try to remember what we eat in the last day, we will have the difficulty to memorize it. How it is, why it is so? We
Oh, okay, good that you asked this question. There's a difference between memorization as a verb versus memory as a noun. You do have memory of what you did yesterday. We all have. Memorization is when you overtly try to commit certain things to your long-term memory. So, so for example, like learning a set of words, or learning a formula, or learning a theory, or even learning a new road to drive, for example. That's an overt act of memorization. So you start on with a goal to memorize. There are many things that we learn, or that is stored in our memory without the goal to memorize it. Say, for example, you took a very nice road trip, all right, to it's highly unlikely now, but just imagine you take a very nice road trip to the hills. You might overtly want to memorize the road signs before you start the trip, or memorize at least the map to a certain extent. Some people are good at it, some people are bad at it, or maybe memorize certain words to use when you are in that town. if that is not a Hindi speaking town or English speaking town, let's say. But you might be able to, you might automatically be storing certain kinds of things in memory, like a very scenic sunset or a very scenic sunrise, or the color of the river that you are driving by, or the trees that you saw, or the birds nest that you have seen. They are all being stored in your memory without you overtly trying to memorize it. And that, this insight was brought forward in psychology long time back in 1960s by a person called Tolman, who was studying how we learn certain things without the overt goal of learning it. And he was studying rats in a maze, and he used to give rats certain food and let the rat find the food in the maze. So the goal for the rat is to find the food. But eventually, when he would put the food in some other place, the rat would still be able to directly go to the food without going to other, getting lost in the maze, which showed that the rat ended up learning the maze itself without there being a goal to learn the maze. Similarly, when you walk from your hostel to your LHC, you don't have the goal to remember certain things, like, let's say, the puppies that you see on the road, for example, or a certain set of flowers that have been grown by the agricultural, the horticulture department at IIT. But that gets stored in our memory. You might also not want to memorize or remember even the path or the kinds of turns that you need to go uh, while you are moving along in the campus, but you do know it. So memory is something as a noun gets stored. Sometimes we have an overt goal to do it, sometimes we might not. Memorization always has an overt goal. When we are starting out with a goal to commit certain things, whatever that is, to our long-term memory. So when you think about yesterday, you all of us will have memory of multiple incidents. Some might be more, some might be less, as I think Spurvi or somebody was pointing out, based on the emotional balance of it, of the importance of it. Some might, some might be much more latent, but probably they are still in memory, especially when it comes to a few hours back. It's more likely that they are in. They will not probably be turned to long-term memory unless they are of very high value to us. So that's another part that will come to in judgment and decision making, that valuation of both objects and people and things and everything become a very, very important factor to figure out what we perceive, what we attend, what we memorize, what we learn, and eventually, what we think that we will do in the future. So valuation becomes a fundamental part of almost all parts of our world. But that's where we are going. But yes, you are right that we don't memorize, but we do remember. So that's why I want to separate these two things out. One is a verb and one is a noun. Is that slightly clearer? At least what I was trying to say. But we have still not answered this question. How do you tie your shoes, or how do you remember to tie your shoes, or to fix your shoes? It's a difficult task, and I will tell you why it's a difficult task. It's not easy to do this thing.
Muscle memory? So maybe because you have been doing it repeatedly over a long period of time.
Yeah, but still it's not obvious. I mean, there are patients that people have documented for certain neurological disorders, they cannot tie shoes anymore. So yes, one is to do with motor control or muscle control and actions, which again is part of memory. So sometimes people call it muscle memory or action-based memory, but they are memory. So one big myth, that you all might not have, but many people have when they start thinking about memory is, oh, memory is something that we memorize. Typically, people think that in terms of sets of words or sets of knowledge systems that are incorporated in education. But memory is much beyond it. It has to do with perception, it has to do with action, it has to do with control, it has to do with emotion, value, balance, and all other stuff. But what neurological research has shown is that there are different kinds of memory. And sometimes some kind of memory might be more affected than the other. for certain people who suffer from certain diseases or certain accidents or stroke even. All right, so how do we know that we have different types of memory? It should not be intuitive, right? It's because we are doing science here, we are not doing philosophy. So the experimental evidence that we have different kinds of memory comes really from neuropsychological disorders, where there are certain aspects of life that gets unaffected and certain aspects of life that gets affected depending on what kind of information needs to be processed for doing that task. The first two, capital of, well, first one is a catch question. The capital of Greenland is something to do with facts. So that is one kind of patience in which facts are something that they can't remember or they can't even learn new facts. Whereas they have no problem to remember their friend or what they did yesterday or how to tie shoes. So that is an scientific evidence to show that factual or what is called declarative memory, which are propositions. X is Y, or X is a part of Y, or X is a subset of Y. These are propositions, logical propositions. And a large part of our life, a large part of our world can be represented using propositions, including capital of this and you know a certain formula or a certain theory, or even relationships between people, relationships between objects, location of an object. Many of these things are propositional logic, and you can use propositional logic or first order logic to be able to explain or to code these things in your knowledge base, and also do the same thing for in computers. Then there's another kind of patients that we found that what they did, the whole event or the whole episode gets lost. Whereas they have no problem to remember facts or they have no problem to, for motor like tie shoes. Then people said, oh, probably this is a different kind of memory. Now, what is that? That came to be called as episodic memory. Episodes. So you store the whole episode as a whole, not in different fragments. Well, it has different parts, but still it's a it's one thing at the end. So it can be an event, it can be a day, it can be an encounter with a person, it can be a whole trip, it can be also whole of IIT, 4 or 5 years. You can consolidate that into think of that as one episode in life. And those things people remember. Of course, you don't remember every single details of an episode. You extract out certain kinds of information from it and form a sparse or a dense representation of the episode depending on how much. So if it's sparse, if you remember some parts of it in the episode, or if it's dense when you remember a lot of things that happen in that episode, again, it's heavily driven by how much importance that has in your life, and hence that makes it emotional. The third kind of memory that gets affected or unaffected is motor memory. That you people forget or people don't forget facts, people forget or they don't forget episodes. They can't remember what they did yesterday at all. Not like us missing a few things, but basically not remember anything at all. They also perhaps they don't remember a lot of facts about the world. However, they're able to they not have any problem for implementing these kinds of motor movements like tying shoes. Whereas there's another group of patients where they have a problem for implementing these motor movements, but they don't have a problem to remember these episodes or these facts. So, this came to be called procedural memory. Procedure. You implement a procedure of tying shoe, you implement a procedure of driving a car, you implement a procedure even of walking or picking a certain thing in a certain way, of bowling, of playing carom, tennis, cricket, whatnot. But they're all procedures because you can implement it as an algorithm based on motor action control. So now that takes us to three kinds of memory. One is declarative, which is here. One is episodic, which is here. And one is procedural, which is here.
So, but there are things like when which we do without recalling, like climbing stairs. But when we think about it, like how are we climbing stairs, we tend to mess up. Like for me, I can climb stairs without any problem, but if I start to think how am I doing it, like putting one leg before the other, then I start messing up. It sometimes happens. Why does it happen like that?
Ah, wonderful. I mean, you can even try that doing with walking. Stairs, of course, is a much more complicated motor control, but walking is slightly easier on the same gradient. But even for walking, it becomes difficult if you start trying to attend to us walking or the act of walking. So it happens because many of these motor procedures are supposed to work independent of attention. Once we start attending to motor movements, because of the fact that we are attending to it, our cognitive resources gets loaded up to extract information from the motor control or the motor movement to process them because we are attending to that. And that automatically takes away the kind of default mechanism that is already in place for kinds of motor action. And this doesn't happen immediately. So when you think about the first time when we started walking, walking was and still is one of the most difficult tasks that we as Homo sapiens actually achieve. In fact, there is no other species alive who can walk in the seamless way as we do with 8 kilos on our shoulders, which is called our skull. So it is not a very easy thing to do. Managing center of gravity perfectly well and not tripping over is one of the hallmarks of walking. And with this we know because now there has been a lot of effort for building robots which can walk seamlessly like a human, and we don't have one. The closest is Asimo, that was built by Honda after years and years and years of engineering research, but still it's not as elegant as a normal human. So it shows that there are certain things which are extremely hard and we learn it after years of practice. Then we go to stairs. Stairs again is very, very hard. If you see a small toddler trying to climb a stair, you realize that it's one of the big struggles that this person is trying to resolve. And we did it. Most people have done that. Once you are good at it, then it becomes an automatic process. Same with driving, by the way. Once you start driving, when you start driving, you have to attend to a lot of information processes and action processes that are there involved in driving or learning to drive either a two-wheeler or a four-wheeler. But once you have done it, it's automatic. Now, after I have learned, if I start attending to it, that attention robs off the resources that was happening more like in double quotes called autopilot, which makes the autopilot fail because that resources are now being put to attending to the task itself. And hence, attending to learned motor control essentially leads to worse performance. And that will happen even for tying shoes, by the way. As simple as that.
So shouldn't it be the other way around? Like when we hear and listen, the difference between hearing and listening. We hear because we have ears and whatever voice is there, we will hear it. But when we pay attention to it, then it is called listening. So shouldn't it be like that for walking also? When we pay attention to walking, we should walk better, right?
No, when you are attending to information that is required for you to walk. Okay, so let's say you're walking after a rain, which is what you will do today if it's raining around you. Here it's raining. And there are all kinds of muddy puddles around. Okay, so you have to attend to information while you are walking. But that information is not, sorry, that attention is not to the act of walking. That attention is towards information that is external to your leg movements. Although that attention helps you moderate your leg movements and hence you don't put your leg in a puddle of water unless you want to do that. So that, when you took the the hearing example, that's very similar to that. You can hear in general about all kinds of stuff, but you can attend to a certain sub part of that field, which here this is an auditory field, which you pay attention to. That is not a problem. But imagine you are paying attention to your act of hearing, then you won't be able to hear. Okay, so right now I am saying something. Imagine yourself trying to attend to how the sounds are coming and entering your ears, and your ear is able to, there are certain small hairs inside all of our ears which resonate at certain frequencies depending on the frequency of the sound, and that leads to the cochlear transplant implant that is there in our ear, which then eventually does a neurochemical transmission that sends a signal from your ear to your auditory cortex in your head, and that helps you understand a certain word depending on whether that word is in your temporal lobe, which is the one that I showed, which gets an input from your frontal lobe and gives you a recognition of this is a word that I know. If you pay attention to these kinds of details about the inner workings, then we will stop hearing altogether, is what I was trying to say.
So
Does it
can
make
I say
sense?
that it's, sir, am I
Yes,
audible?
go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Sir, can I say that it's done by our subconscious mind, that we are not actively participating in that? That for an example, that if we are tying our shoes and at the same time we are talking to another person, then we can say that we are conscious, we are using our conscious mind for talking, and we are using our subconscious mind for tying our shoes. It, can I say like this?
Yeah, so I typically avoid the subconscious, conscious, supraconscious, subliminal, subconscious, these kinds of terminologies because they, they have a history of their own, and they are sometimes even complicated to understand. And many a times they are misunderstood or misrepresented. But overall, what you are saying is right. That's why I use the word autopilot or not paying attention instead of using subconscious. I think of this as more of an automatic system that is working on its own because we are very good at it. So once we learn a motor task and we are very good at it, it happens on its own without us having to, add more cognitive resources to it. That's how I talk about it and avoid the words subconscious and unconscious and conscious and stuff like that, because it's not very clear where one level stops and where one level starts. And it has a very complicated and messed up academic history of usage also. But yeah, the essence that you are saying and what I'm saying is the same. But the terms that I use typically stay away from consciousness deliberately. Okay, so let me move to a couple of more things. So yeah, this is something that I've already talked about, which is that we can retain and draw on our past experiences, and we use information. This is the part that's important. So you can think of memory both as a storehouse of information and also as a process that's going on when information processing is happening. Three important mechanisms. One is encoding of information. Then you have to store the information, so it's storage, and then it's retrieval of information. This is something that I've already talked about. We can study memory by studying recall versus recognition. And there are two types, explicit versus implicit. Now, this is the terminology that we would want to utilize instead of using subconscious. So implicit memory is something like the one that right now you are talking about, and I was talking about, which has to, or somebody else was also talking about, which is about climbing stairs, walking, tying shoes, driving, and also other factual information which could be implicit, which I will show you in a minute. And the other stuff, which is very obvious and right in front, is explicit. Okay, so now let me show that with an example. So these are two kinds of tasks that people use to study memory. One is a recall task and one is a recognition task. So in a recall task, you will be asked to recall the name of a comedian who has certain characteristics, whatever that is. Whereas in recognition, you will be asked which of these people is a comedian, and you will be given these things. There are different kinds of recall tasks that people have studied in the lab. So the first one of these are this thing that you see, which is you associate. So you associate apple with S, ball with H, cat with G, dog with T, elephant with X. They are random, as you can see. You can do any kind of association. Question is, how good can people learn this new information that I give? This is a new information because nobody associated any of this before. At least that's what we assume. So after I've associated apple with S and ball with H, cat with C, G, dog with T, elephant with X, I can make you remember, or you can make yourself remember in a certain manner. But when I ask you to recall it, I can ask you to do three kinds of recall. Number one is called a serial recall, which means that you have to tell me this association in exactly the same manner as it is presented while you were encoding information. Now let's also start using some terminologies here. When you're storing this information, you're encoding. After storage, when you are retrieving the information, it's called retrieval. You can retrieve that based on either recall task, which is what is here, or recognition task. In recall, there can be three kinds of recall. I ask you to recall it in exactly the same manner in which it was presented. So you have to tell me apple, S, ball, H, cat, G, dog, T, elephant, X. Anything outside this order is a wrong answer. So this is where order matters. In free recall, you can recall this in any manner, and the seriality does not matter. So you can recall it in any random manner. You get a correct answer if you recall all of that, but not in any specific manner. In queued recall, I tell you, okay, apple, and you have to tell me S. Then I tell you dog, you have to tell me T. So this queued recall is easier than free recall. Free recall is easier than serial recall as far as metacognitive or the effort or the difficulty level of the task is concerned. However, please realize that these kinds of retrieval mechanisms are also part of memory. So memory is not just storage or storehouse. Memory is encoding, memory is storage, memory is recall. All put together is what memory is. So any idea why our serial recall task is most difficult and the queued recall task is easiest? Maybe take an example from your exams and tell us why do you think that probably is? Because I'm sure all of us have experienced this in real life too. This is a lab task, but can you give me a real life example of this?
It might be because our brain holds many, a lot of information, and if we give it a sort of cue, then it is easier to relate. It will, our brain will think that yes, this word was related to this information, and it will recall that information easily.
Yeah, you're right. No, I was trying to ask, can you give me a real life example from examinations, kind of questions, for example?
Multiple choice questions are easier than fill in the blanks or subjective type of questions.
Yeah. Which is the easiest kind of question that you can get in an exam?
MCQ.
True, false.
True, false.
Yeah, true, false.
Wait, now we have two answers. Is it MCQ or is it true, false?
True, false, sir.
Sir, I think they both are of some form of queued recall questions, right?
So let's go one by one. So what is an MCQ as far as memory theory is concerned? What does it test?
So like in a MCQ, you have to give in a more than one option, and only some of maybe one or more than one are correct. Not all are correct. So just it check that you know what is the right option approximately.
All right. And what does it assume you to have done? By the way, MCQ can also be difficult, as most of you might know. At least it should be. At least, I mean, many people regard IIT, JEE, and GATE to be one of the most difficult exams in the world. But then you also have exams like CAT, which is again one of the few difficult exams in the world. But you also have exams like SAT and GRE, which are not so difficult exams of the world. So MCQs themselves can be made pretty difficult to pretty easy. What is it that makes it easy or difficult? Any idea? So I hope you're realizing what we are doing. We are trying to understand how memory operates, learning new terminology about memory in psychology, trying to explain that using examples from real life, specifically about student learning. Okay, so that's what we are trying to do, just in case any of you are lost.
Sir,
Okay,
in
yeah, go ahead.
MCQ can be made difficult by if they give similar options, which might confuse our brain.
Yeah, so that's one way to make it difficult. But does all MCQs really work on recognition, as some of you were saying, or they could do something else also?
Sir, I think the difficulty of the question is more related to the question itself. But for example, if we ask the same question in three different types, for example, in a fill in the blanks format, in a MCQ format, and in a subjective format, then we will all say that the subjective one is more difficult because we have to think in a procedural format, in a step by step, on a step by step basis.
Yeah, I mean, subjective one is we can't talk of subjective right now because it requires many other complex processes. But currently, we can talk of fill in the blanks and MCQ, and also different kinds of MCQ. So even if you are able to compare fill in the blanks with MCQ, so fill in the blanks is of course recall, MCQ is recognition. That's fine, which is factual. But what about the MCQs which are not based on recognition? Then what happens?
The certain
And
MCQs
fill in.
demand that we solve the question and pick the correct numerical value. So they are quite difficult for us because we need to be precise. Because any of the option can be correct. It is based on the error if we have made during the calculation.
Yeah. Good. So I think that's where the crux is. Now that is clearly not a recognition task, right? It has to also have some kind of procedural memory, because you have to know a formula or you have to know a process to be able to arrive at a certain answer.
sir, can we leave? We have a session at 1:30.
Oh, okay. So then I will stop today, but we'll continue from here from Monday's class, which is a normal class.
Sir,
Okay. Yeah.
I have a question that, sir, you have said that how we hear and the process we do inside. So all these are controlled by our brain. So why we can't memorize them? I mean, we have to learn all those process from outside, but all those signals are given by our brain, but we can't memorize them.
I'm sorry, I did not really understand your question.
So like you said, how we hear, like we hear the sound waves coming to close to our ear, then hit that diaphragm and so on, and all those signals and all those things are done by our brain. So our brain knows what is happening or what's going on, but we don't memorize these things, or we don't know them. So why is, I mean, this happen? We can only learn these process through outside, I mean through education or something.
Oh, I see. So you are saying, how can't why don't we experience our ears vibrating, for example, with the sound that while it's processing it? So you are not experiencing certain kinds of things that happening in your body right now, or you can't even remember that it has happened. That's your
Yes sir,
question.
but our brain knows all of it,
Hmm.
because and that's why it is giving all the signals on that thing.
Yeah, I mean, there's a different way I would think about the brain than that. So it's not like the brain knows. Brain is not like a outside you. When you say the brain knows, it starts to seem as if our brains are different from ourselves. We are our brains, right? So what the way to perhaps conceptualize this, and what you're asking is a very, very deep philosophical question, also a very important scientific question, and people are very divided on it. So I will give you I'll try to give you a slightly more simplistic, personal answer, which is that you think of the whole body comprising of multiple systems, okay? And information is being processed within that system, and also information is being processed across different systems. So the hearing system is more of a subsystem in your overall body. Similarly, the brain is also a subsystem in your body. However, the brain is linked to multiple subsystems via the central nervous system, which is our spinal cord. Now that enables the brain to send signals or receive signals from multiple of these subsystems, like a hub. However, the brain actually does not control every single minute detail of every single system. That's why you can build an artificial ear. Now there is some research I have been following because I have been interested in that. You can build an artificial nose. Now you can also build an artificial heart. Now the act of being able to build something artificially, which is your bioengineering, and many people, some of you might end up working in these areas. When you're building a subsystem independently inside the lab, that clearly shows you don't need a brain for doing that, right? So we have these subsystems which are semi-autonomous or sometimes autonomous. However, they are linked to multiple subsystems, and that linkage is happening through the spinal cord, not through the brain all the time. The brain is linked to the spinal cord. So there is some kind of communication channel that exists between the brain and the spinal cord, which then relates to many other parts of other subsystems of our body. But that is not to say that when a certain diaphragm is moving in your ear, the brain is one that is doing it, or the brain is one that is aware of it, or knows it, or controls it. It's going to move anyway. If you cut off that ear and keep it in the lab separately and impound sound waves on it, it is going to move. What is not going to happen is it's not going to get integrated with the sensory system, which is a requirement for us to be able to hear something. So that's how I think you should think about the body, of comprising of multiple subsystems with a major control mechanism embedded between your spinal cord and the brain together, that enables us to communicate within and between multiple systems. But there are certain independent processing that's happening. So for example, I don't know if any of you know about nanomotors, which is in an area of nanoscience. We have plenty of nanomotors working independently inside our cells right now without the brain having any clue about it. And that you can replicate in the lab. People have done that in nanomaterials engineering. But for us to operate as a whole system, as one person, we need the brain and the spinal cord. That's why the operational definition of being alive is when your brain is alive. It's not when your heart is alive. The operational definition, the medical operational definition of an alive person is when that person's brain is operational. A brain dead person technically is dead. And that is where all these questions and debates about euthanasia is coming for deep coma patients. So it's a fundamental aspect of being alive. That's how important that is. But that doesn't mean it is separate from yourself or we. We are one single entity, and brain is one very important facet of this overall system. That's how I think about it, if that helps you. But when once you start talking as if the brain is different from you, or the brain made me do it, or my mind made me do it, then who are you? I know people talk about like that in movies, in books, or even in colloquial language, but whenever you hear that, you should ask a question. If my mind made me, that means my mind is separate from me, or my brain made me, then my brain is separate from me. then how can I exist as a person? And that's why I said this is both a philosophical and a scientific question. Of course, this we can talk about this for the whole day, but yeah, if you have any follow-up questions, or if any of your friends want to add to that, you all could, and others who have a class, please leave.
Sir, just one follow-up question because I read an article about this somewhere. There was a case in, I don't know, maybe America, USA or so. It is an old case where the person had almost his entire brain was compressed into a very small portion and he was still living his life as a normal person. I have read the article. I think I can find the link to
And his brain was filled with water, most of the part.
fluid, cerebrospinal fluid.
Yes, fluid.
Yes.
His spinal fluid.
But he or she was leading a normal life
Yes, sir.
or
Yes, sir.
alive. They are two different.
Yes, sir.
Normal
But the
life, sir.
pain
He
in his
went to a
skull.
medical practitioner for some issue. He was maybe having some headache or so. And when the MRI came, it showed that he had almost all of his brain was compressed into a very thin area.
And how long was he alive?
I don't know about that, sir.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, there are these special cases. There's actually a whole area in neuropsychology which studies special cases and tries to understand what we can from what some people think, anomalies, which is not the normal um, person. I don't know about this case, but of course, if you send that to me, I will be happy to read and gather some information. I can also ask a couple of my neuroscience friends what they think about it, and we can get back on it. I don't know that case myself, but there are cases of cerebrospinal fluid filling up in the brain, and many a times that typically requires a surgery. That's the standard medical response to filling up. In fact, if liquids get filled up in any part of your body, you have to extract that out. That's the standard medical response to it, whether it is your stomach or whether it's your brain, whatever, or even your limbs. Because it's not natural. See, fluids are supposed to be within certain sacs. So anytime there is a spillover, then it has to be taken care of medically. However, having said that, there are a lot of cases where people have been able to lead not exactly the normal life, but you would think that this person would be dead anyway, but still that person has been able to do a lot of things with a very abnormal brain. Sometimes due to size, sometimes due to stroke, sometimes also due to accidents. Accidents as bad as a whole steel pole getting inside the head or a bullet getting stuck in the skull. But still, they not just survive, they are still able to do a whole lot of things. And that now neuroscientists explain because of what they call neuroplasticity. One hugely interesting thing that the brain as an organ is able to do is to rewire itself. And once it rewires, you can let other parts of the brain take care of some other part of the brain. You can also, it automatically regrows itself. So just like, you prune trees and trees grow, you prune cells and cells grow. That's a common biological fact. Brain is no different, right? So if you have a scar in your hand, you are going to, most probably, it's going to be healed. Or even if you have a big accident, still most probably you're going to be healed. That's only possible because of cell regrowth. It depends on the age and other kinds of comorbidities of the person, including hormonal questions or diabetes and other kinds of stuff. But if all else is fine, then typically it will grow and it will get better. And that's also the whole point of stem cell therapy, as some of you might know, that enables you even to fight cancer that way, just to kind of outgrow the bad cells. And that's a common cellular mechanism that happens any part of the body, including the brain, of course, because brain eventually is what it's essentially predominantly made up of a certain kind of cell, or actually one large kind of cell which could have multiple subkinds, which are the neurons. But neurons is not one kind. You can have 5 different kinds of neurons, and a lot of glia, which is, well, till now people are figuring out what that is, but they are more like sticky material between the cells, the neuronal cells that help the neural cells to transmit. And it has a whole amount of blood vessels and a whole lump of flesh. That's what the brain is, and it's not something very peculiar. It just is something that we don't understand intricately. Many of the stuff is because we can't convert the language, which is a psychological language, to a neurological language. So it's, when we talk of recall and recognition, we are fine to talk about it in psychology by using these tasks, but we can't really pen it down exactly to the operations of the brain as of now. That's where the struggle is, or the interest of neuroscience or cognitive neuroscience is at this point. But to be able to computationally model, yes, we have made significant progress in that. Psychologically, we have made a lot of progress, both experimental and field psychology. But the neuropsychology part, for doing the exact mapping, is where we, you know, are still at a very early stage.
Sir, I had a doubt in the third slide.
Oh, yes, sorry. Third slide, yeah. Wait, let me share that.
No, sir, that not that particular. I just wanted to ask, like, I have read somewhere that hormones actually help in memory. Like, for example, adrenaline, it helps in storing information in permanent memory. So, is it so?
Um, it's not a binary thing, I believe, because different kinds of hormones should have different kinds of effects on memory. And it's also memory of what kind, because memory itself again is not a unitary concept. Right? You can talk of at least 3 kinds of memory I talked about, but on the other side, on the other axis, you can have loaded or emotionally loaded and less loaded and more loaded memory. So certain kinds of hormones will help in certain kinds of memory formation, yes. Certain kinds of hormones will also cause a problem for certain kind of memory formation. That's also true. Which hormone helps or does not help which kind of memory formation is a part of very active research in neuropharmacology. And there the story is, whatever little I know, is a little complex, well, pretty complex to be precise. So to be able to say that hormones help or does not help memory is oversimplifying the thing, because hormones themselves have come into existence through millions of years of evolution to serve certain kinds of functional goals in us. And accordingly, it should technically affect, if it affects, certain kinds of memory in certain kinds of ways. That's how the real picture looks like. Yeah. Yes.
I think parasympathetic system also plays a large role in the in organizing the body functions.
Your sound broke in between to me. I couldn't get exactly what you were saying.
I was saying that the parasympathetic system also plays a major role in organizing or doing the function across the body system.
Oh yes, of course. I mean, yeah, I didn't touch upon those kinds of terms just to stay a little bit away from bio terminology. But yeah, I mean, essentially we have 2 kinds of systems. One is sympathetic and one is parasympathetic. And parasympathetic is more of a automatic kind. And it plays a huge role. And in fact, just the idea that you are anxious or just overeating or undereating, we have a lot of evidence now of how that influences all things, including memory. So the way your heart operates, the way your lungs operate, the way your digestive system operates, and many other systems operate, plays a lot of, has a lot of influence on what we learn, how much we learn, what we do with it, how much we're able to store, retrieve, work with later on, and many other intricacies. So, and that's again reiterating the point of not being able to separate out biology from psychology, and also from different texts, different chapters of psychology from each other. Yeah, you're right.
Yeah, I also sent you mail last time. I also mentioned about it.
Oh, okay. So let me just note it down. I'll try to look at it today itself, Lavi. I'm so sorry.
Sir,
Yes, Ashish.
sir, what is the effect of a dopamine hormone on our memory?
Specifically, dopamine, you mean?
A dopamine hormone.
Latest research I have not really catched up with. When you say about the effect, but
Yes, sir.
the essential thing about so then I have to talk about what is a neurotransmitter. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter. So neurotransmitters typically help you communicate between neurons, and they do that by getting associated to the edges of the neurons, which are called synaptic clefts or sites, synaptic synapses. Dopamine is one that plays a crucial role in that kind of communication. Now, when I say crucial role, it means that it plays a very important role in ensuring there is, um, that is a deep communication between neurons, which helps in more long-term learning. That much is pretty clear, but it's also related heavily to the emotional circuit, which is what happens in the midbrain area, which I have not really talked about. Midbrain is slightly more deeper within the brain, and dopamine, or sometimes it's called the dopaminergic network technically in neuroscience, uh, is responsible for a lot of emotional processing, and both for coding and for retrieval of of things which are emotional in nature. So when I say emotional, you can learn something which is very emotional. You can also recall something which is very emotional. You can also act based on something which is very emotional. And dopamine seems to be an active constituent, chemical constituent for um, that triggers actions towards emotional content through the sites within the midbrain where it is present in a large amounts. So when you say what's the role, it's a little it's a little broad question, or sometimes a little vague question, but typically you can think of dopamine as being one neurotransmitter which is extensively involved in transmission between neurons, specifically to do with emotions or emotional situations.
Okay, sir. Thank you.
Okay, so I think we should stop now. So I'll leave the meeting. We'll see you all on Monday at the class time.
Sir, please stop recording.
Oh, yes.
Thank you, sir.